In this chapter, we'll see how to implement another advanced component from Telerik UI for ASP.NET Core, the grid. One of our new requirements for the RPS Project Tracker version 2 list of backlog items is to make it pageable and sortable. The grid can handle these features, as well as over 100 other features including filtering, grouping, and editing. Because the grid is so configurable and there are so many features, I really suggest having the documentation site open while you develop so that you can use it for reference. And as I mentioned earlier, you should also have the grid demo site open. Now, while the grid can be data bound to local or remote data, in this chapter we're going to be rendering the data server side, and the grid will automatically fetch data from the server while paging. We'll see this in action shortly. So in this chapter, we'll set up the grid and configure it to display our backlog items, and then we'll add paging and sorting. If we navigate to our backlog page, here you'll see a table. This is just an HTML table rendering our backlog items. And while this is just fine for a certain number of items, we do want to add paging and sorting here, which we currently don't have. And if we have a lot more items, then this list will become unwieldy. So we do want to retain some of the look and feel here. We're going to replace some of these columns, and we're going to try to keep them looking the same way by using templates. We'll get back to that later in this chapter. For now, let's just get some data displaying here. I'm going to head over to the code, and I'm going to stop the running process right now. Let's close out the dashboard page and open up pages, backlog, and then the items.cshtml file, and also expand this and open up the model for the items. Items model does have a reference to items, which is the list of PT item. This is what we're using to render our table. But PT item is a database entity. In our case, we're just faking it, but that's what it's supposed to be here. Let's create a more useful model that we can easily bind to on the front end, which we'll use to display our grid items. In fact, I've already created this model for you. If we take a look at models and then PT item grid model, this will just have all the items we want to display in simple data structure format, integers, strings, and datetimes. So alongside of this items property, I'm going to create another property that's going to be a list of PT item grid model. Let's import that. I'm going to call this one grid data. This is just going to have a getter on it. First, we're going to check to see if the local items property is not null. And if it's not, then we're going to return items, but we're going to map that to the PT item grid models. And if items is null, then we'll just return a new list. And that's all the code we have to write. So I'm going to kick off our server again. There's our application. I'm going to head to backlog. And let's go over to our items.cshtml view now. Here's where we're displaying the table responsive. I'm going to keep this around for now just so I have a comparison point. But let me go ahead and collapse the code there. Okay, and here is where I'm going to create my Kendo grid. Now, I could use the tag helper here. That is available for us to use. But at the moment, the HTML helper has a few more functions implemented that I'm going to need. So I'm going to actually use the HTML helper in this case. And that's going to be html.kendo.grid. And of course, since we're using the HTML helper, we can use the Fluent API to provide the name. And I'm just going to call this one grid. Now into the grid function, I need to give it the data, and that's going to be model.gridData. That's the property that we've just created. If I save this and we take a look at this in the browser, you will see that the grid is actually generated already, and it's showing us all the items, but it's interpreting what the columns should mean. You can see that the table headings are actually generated by the grid, but it's not displaying in the right order, and it's not showing us the styling that we want to apply. It's showing us the ID column. We don't want to see that. The dates are not displayed correctly, and the avatars are displayed as strings and not images. So we do have some work here. If you do have a simple grid, it does do a pretty good job of just guessing based on the data types how you want your columns to look. But to be able to configure these a little bit better, we're going to use the grid columns, and we're going to configure each column separately. By providing the data objects for the grid to bind to, we're leaving it up to the grid to determine how to display that data. And sometimes it takes a pretty good guess, but other times we need to tweak it a little bit. And that's where grid column definitions come in. Right now, our grid is displaying all the properties of the objects we're binding to, but we don't want to display all of them. Let's start off just by displaying the title. So as soon as we add one column definition that we want to display, the grid is going to make the assumption that you want to take control of displaying the columns yourself. We can configure the columns by using the grid's Fluent API. This is the HTML helper version. and it has the columns function that we can configure, which takes in a configurator function. Here we can specify what we want to do with the columns. So in our case, we want to specify that we want to bind this column. And the nice thing about this Fluent API is that it's all strongly typed. So I can say C dot, and this knows what object we're binding to. So it's going to give us only the available properties. I'm going to find title here and put a semicolon at the end there. Because we're in a code block, you need semicolons here to complete the statement. I'm going to save this and let's take a look. Now you can see that our grid is only displaying the title and nothing else, because it knows that now we want to configure the columns ourselves. So as an exercise, please go through and add all the columns that we are displaying in our table to the grid. You can pause the video to do that. All right, I'm going to go ahead and proceed now. So before the title column, we have two other columns. I'm going to configure these now. First, I'm going to bind the type column, and then I'm also going to bind the assignee column. In this case, our grid data model has assignee avatar or assignee full name. For now, I'm going to start with the full name, but we're going to switch it to avatar in a little bit. Let's take a look. Now here you see that the defined columns are actually placed in the grid in the order that we've defined them. So order matters here. There's also a few other things we can do. The grid is currently spacing out these columns automatically, but we can control how wide we want the columns to be. Also, take a look at the titles here. For the type column, I don't want to show any column name or anything in the heading here, and I'll show you how to handle that. And for the assignee column, I just wanted to say assignee, not assignee full name. Let's fix that. So we can further configure each of the columns by using the Fluent API, and you can see what's available for us to configure. One of the properties we can configure is the title. So for the type column, I don't want to show anything in the title, so I do need to specify a space here. I'm going to send in the string, and it needs to contain a space. And for the assignee column, I want the title to be assignee. Now we can also configure the width of the columns. So I know that I'm going to show an icon for the type. I want this to be a very narrow column, so I'm going to set that to be width of 50. And for the assignee, I'm going to show an avatar, so a width of 120 will be enough. All right, now you can see that the first column doesn't have a heading. The second column is properly named. Let's go ahead and configure the rest of the columns that we're going to need. We're going to need priority. We're going to need estimate, and we're also going to need the created date. So this property is called date created. I want to rename it to just the word created. So I'm going to give it a title, and I'm going to set the width to be 160. Okay, so there's our data, and we have all the columns we want to display with none of the columns we don't want to display. And we also have our columns in the order that we want them in. However, we still see that the grid is displaying the items not the way we want them to be displayed. For example, we want the first column to contain icons, the second column to contain avatars, and we want the priority column to have a badge icon. We also want the date formatted properly. We're going to skip the status column because that's just not really necessary. So how can we change the way these columns are displayed? Well, if you guessed templates, then you are correct. We want to be able to control how each of our columns is displayed, and we can do this with templates. Now, one difference between the Telerik UI for ASP.NET Core is that you cannot specify server-rendered templates here. You can only specify client-rendered templates. So let's do that now for the date column here. We have this created column, and the date is not displayed quite like we want it to. Now, we've already done some templates earlier in this course, so you might want to try this yourself. As an exercise, go ahead and add a template to our column definition here for the created column and come back when you're done. All right, let's do this together now. I'm going to go ahead and paste in a client-side template here. This is similar to what we did before. That's why I'm not typing it all out. And even the syntax is the same here. We're using the templated syntax here with #: to open up the client-side JavaScript context. Our data variable in our case is actually going to be a PT item grid model type. So it has a date created, and we're using the JavaScript toDate string function on it. Now we just need to use this template and attach it to our column. So this is our column that has a date created. I'm going to break this up to several lines here, just so that we can see it a little bit better. And here I'm going to specify the template. But when I start typing template, you'll notice that template is not actually available. That's the server-side template, and that's available in Telerik UI ASP.NET MVC, but not in Core. Here we can only use client templates. So the one we want is called client template ID. I'm going to specify client template ID, and that's going to be a string, and that's just going to be this string right here. Let's save that and take a look. And there we go. Now our created column has a nicely styled date. Specifying client templates for each column is fine, but there's actually an easier way where you can take a block of HTML and just specify the entire row as a template. Let's take a look at that next. The Kendo grid allows us to specify an entire row as a template. So we can take a piece of HTML that's for the entire row and just use that instead of defining separate templates for each column. So back in our code here, I'm going to remove this client template ID for the date column, and we no longer will need this date created template. So I'm going to delete that. And right after our column definitions, I'm going to paste in the client row template. This takes a little bit of time to type in, so I'm going to paste it in to save you the trouble. Of course, just as a reminder, this code is available for you to download should you need to copy and paste the code to follow along. So here is an example of a row template that's rendered on the client. Now notice that we are including the TR tags. Since the grid is rendered as an HTML table, the client row template does require that we define the TR tags as well as the TD tags for each of the table data items. But as far as the syntax for the templating engine, that's exactly the same as what we've been using. I'm going to save this and show this to you, and then we'll go through some of the details here. Let's refresh the page, and you'll see that we already have everything configured here to look nice. We have the image in the first column, the avatar in the second column, and the badge styling for the priority column. Let's take a look at the details here so we can see what's happening. Now for the first column, that's the type column, we're showing an image, and we're calling a JavaScript function that returns us the image source based on the type. This JavaScript function is actually defined right down here. I've added this as well. This is in your final project, but not in your work in progress project. So take a look at this. Here's a script inside the scripts section, and we have this new function called image res from type. By passing in the type here, we're able to return the image. So if the type is PBI, we'll return the PBI icon, and so on. Similar to that, we have this getIndicator class for the priority column. So based on the priority, we're going to return a different class here. We've seen these classes earlier in the course. And this function is actually used in the template as well. It's used right here for our priority column, where we're calling getIndicator class and passing in data.priority. You've already seen the date created column in our template, but now you're seeing it here again in the client row template. We're done with the display of the columns. Let's take a look at some of the other requirements we need to implement for our grid, and that's paging and sorting. Giving our grid paging and sorting capabilities is pretty trivial using the Fluent API for the HTML helpers. We'll do that in a second. First, I want to show you another configuration option. Right now, our grid is quite long. We can configure the height of the grid by using another Fluent API function here. We're going to call the scrollable function. This will allow us to configure the scroll, and I can set the height of the grid to be 430. So this will limit the height of the grid, and it'll make the grid area scrollable. There we go. That's a little bit better. And now let's make this grid pageable as well. We do that simply by calling the pageable function, and this will make the grid pageable on the client side. You can see that down at the bottom, we now have a pager. It's showing us 1 through 10 of 106 items total. And if we scroll a little bit, you'll see that only 10 items are displayed here. Now here's the pager. We can navigate it from page to page using the arrows here, or we can select the page that we want to jump to directly like that. Now this pager is responsive, and because of my screen size, it's showing as this kind of selection menu. If my screen size was a little bigger, I'm going to resize my window here. You can see that the pager is now showing 10 pages at a time, and you can page your data this way. We also want to make this data sortable. That's pretty easy too. All we need to do is just add a sortable function here, and that's it. Let's head back here. I'm going to click refresh. And now by clicking on the headings, you can sort the data. So now I'm sorting title in descending order. I can sort the title in ascending order. You can tell how we're sorting by the little arrow, and you can even cycle to the original position where it's not sorted. By the way, sortable and pageable are configurable. we're just looking at simple examples of how to make our grid sortable and pageable. But if you need further control, please take a look at the documentation site and the demo site for more examples. Now there's one more feature in our application that's missing. This was present in our table down here. When we click on one of the items, it navigates us to the details page. But now in the grid, I'm clicking on the items and we're not navigated anywhere. So we need to re-enable that functionality, and we'll do that in the next lesson. There's one piece of functionality that we used to have that we now don't have, and that's being able to navigate to the details page for each of these items just by clicking on it. You can do that with the Telerik UI grid as well, and we'll accomplish this by using selectable in combination with the configurable events. Let's take a look at that right now. Now, before I show you how to do this using grid events, if you have a keen eye, you might have noticed that we have a client row template here. And since we're just defining HTML here and we're able to call JavaScript from here, and our requirement is to navigate from the items page to the details page, which is a separate URL, all we need to do is just add an onClick event to our HTML here, and we can navigate that way. But we want to do this the Kendo grid way. So first, we're going to need to make the grid selectable by calling the selectable function. What does selectable do? Well, it allows us to select a row. In fact, with Kendo grid, you can select multiple rows, and you can configure selectable to allow multiple selections. This is useful for when you want to bulk delete something, or if you want to edit a few rows at a time. We're going to use selectable slightly differently. When you select a row, you can see that it turns pink here. This will fire off a separate event. So this will fire off an onChange event on the grid, and we need to listen for that. So let's configure events, and we can do that using the events function here, which will allow us to configure the events. And if we take a look at the configurator, you can see all the different events that we can handle on the grid. And there's quite a few of them. The one we're looking for is change. So I'm going to specify the onChange handler here. And this is a JavaScript function that's going to be called every time something with the grid changes. So I need to define this function. Let's head down to the bottom here where we have our script tag. I'm going to create a new function called onChange, which is going to take in some arguments. And arg has a sender on it, which is the actual grid. And the select function will let us know what rows are selected. Since we only have one row selected, we'll know we can take a look at row 0. So with the help of jQuery here, I'm going to take a look at row 0. And the reason we're using jQuery is because I want to use its find function. In order to navigate to the details page, we need to provide the item ID. And if we take a look at the client template, in the first data cell, I've created a div inside there, and I've given it a class ptindicator, which will allow us to find that item by class. And then I also have a data ID attribute that I've added on. Now, data dash attributes don't really interfere with HTML at all. You can tack on whatever you want using data dash. In this case, I'm using data dash ID to store the ID of each item in the row. So we need to access that ID. So for each row, I'm going to use the find function, and I want to find the ptindicator, which is going to give us that div. And let's take a look at the actual element here. And here I need to use jQuery one more time. So I need to wrap this object. Excuse me, I'm missing parentheses here. So rows of 0 is going to give us the row, the tr tag, and using jQuery, we can use the find operator. We'll find that div by class name. We'll look at the first div. Okay. And now we can use jQuery again to get the attribute, which is data-id. This line of code is not my proudest moment, but this will work for now for the demo purposes. So I'm going to store this item ID in the item ID variable. And now we just need to navigate our browser to that location. So I'm going to use a templated string here. And our format for the routes is item ID comes first / details. Let's take a look at that. I'm going to refresh the page. And I'm going to click on one of these items, Cross Media Visualize eServices. Let's click on that, and we navigate to the details page. You can see the item ID is placed there, and the details URL is there, and this is the correct item. So that's an introduction to the grid. There's a lot more things you can do with the grid. For example, editing is a really useful scenario. You can take a look at the documentation and the demos, which have a lot of examples that you can use to cover some of the scenarios you might face out in the real world. Telerik UI Grid has a number of other features and integrations that really expand its utility in any application, and the feature set is constantly growing. I'd like to show you a few more useful features that you may find useful in your own applications that use the Telerik Grid. We're not going to go through these features in detail, but I will mention where to find the documentation should you need to implement these in your own applications. One of the features is column and row virtualization. The grid allows you to virtualize rows and columns. Row virtualization being the most popular option, where you want to provide endless scrolling functionality to display a large amount of data by appending additional pages of data on demand. Loading of new items happens when the scroll bar of the grid reaches its end, and when the data is returned, only the new items are rendered and appended to the old ones. This infinite scrolling works with either remote data or local data. Column virtualization is also possible and is useful in cases where you may need to operate with a large amount of columns in the grid, and displaying them at once would impose a performance penalty due to the limited browser resources. Both row and column virtualization can be enabled by calling the scrollable extension method on the grid. Another feature is hierarchy. There are projects that require the display of data in a hierarchical-like fashion in order to visualize relationships between parent and child records. To implement hierarchy with the Telerik UI data grid, you need to set the client detail template ID, which specifies the ID of the script element that contains the client-side detail template. And then you need to define the script tag that will be shown when the user expands the data grid rows. Another common scenario in applications is to save user customizations and settings when interacting with your app. And then when the user returns to the app, you can restore those settings, and this provides a better user experience. The grid uses local storage key-value pairs to save the grid state to the client and can restore the settings automatically at a later time, or you can control the settings using getOptions and setOptions client-side methods on the grid. There are scenarios which may be required to display a large number of grid columns on a limited screen space. Making some of the columns static when scrolling horizontally is a concept that is well known in programs like Microsoft Excel, and many users like to utilize this in a web environment as well. UI Grid supports these kinds of locked or frozen columns by a single configuration setting. Simply set the locked Boolean flag for the corresponding column, and that column will be locked in place in the UI. The grid also provides functionality that enables users to work with subsets of grid data. It can enable single range selection or multiple range selection. And to select a range, the user would simply left-click and drag across a selection of cells. And you can even select a combination of ranges by holding down the control key and making another selection. These are just some of the advanced grid features, and the grid provides a ton of built-in functionality on top of this. Please take a look at the demos and the documentation for all the latest additions to the Telerik UI Grid component and its integrations.